Do you even know where you are, old man? The question cut through the oppressive South Carolina heat, like a drill sergeant's blade. Sergeant Eva Rostova stood with her hands locked on her hips, every muscle in her frame radiating controlled fury. Before her, seated on a weathered wooden bench near the edge of Parris Island's infamous obstacle course, sat a man who looked impossibly out of place. His name was Randall Morrison. He was 82 years old, his skin darkened and creased like old leather left too long in the sun. But it wasn't his age that made him remarkable. It was his absolute stillness. While chaos swirled around him, while young recruits screamed and struggled through their training, he simply sat and watched with eyes the color of faded denim. "This is a United States Marine Corps recruit depot," Rostova continued, her voice rising with each word. "Not a park bench for you to sit and watch the world go by." She took a deliberate step closer, her polished boots crunching on the dusty gravel. Behind her, Platoon 3087 had frozen mid-stride, their brutal workout suspended by the unexpected confrontation. 70 young men and women, all barely old enough to buy beer, watched their fearsome drill instructor face off against a silent octogenarian. The old man's eyes shifted slowly from the recruits to the sergeant. There was no fear there, no anger, just a quiet presence that somehow made Rostova even more furious. "I know exactly where I am," Sergeant Randall said. His voice was soft but clear, carrying decades of authority that Rostova couldn't hear. The confrontation had been building for over an hour. Randall had arrived without fanfare in a modest sedan, parking in the visitor's lot and making his way to the training field's edge. He hadn't spoken to anyone, hadn't asked permission. He'd simply found this bench under a scraggly pine tree and settled in to watch. At first, the drill instructors had ignored him. Parris Island got its share of lost tourists and confused family members. But Randall wasn't lost. His gaze was too focused, too knowing. He watched the recruits with an analytical eye that suggested he was evaluating them, their form, their heart, their potential. To Rostova, it felt like judgment, and she didn't answer to anyone except her commanding officer. "Can I help you?" she'd asked earlier, the words more command than question. Randall had simply shaken his head, just watching. That answer hadn't satisfied her. In her world, everything required permission, authorization, a chain of command. This old man's quiet defiance was an affront to the very order she was sworn to maintain. Now, with the sun beating down and her patience exhausted, she pressed harder. "Who gave you permission to be here?" "I don't believe I need any," Randall replied, his tone maddeningly calm. Two other drill instructors, Sergeants Gunn and Chavez, drifted closer, forming a triangle of authority around the bench. The humid air grew thick with tension. It was about to get much thicker. "That's it," Rostova snapped, her patience finally shattering. "I want your ID. You're on a secure military installation, and you're interfering with training operations." Her voice carried across the field, sharp enough to cut. "Give me your identification or I'll have the military police escort you out in handcuffs." The recruits watched wide-eyed. This was more intense than any exercise. Their terrifying drill instructor, the woman whose voice could strip paint, was going toe-to-toe with someone's grandfather. Randall Morrison moved slowly, reaching into his jacket pocket with deliberate care. His movements had that quality, the absence of rush, the complete lack of fear. To Rostova, it read as disrespect. She saw his age not as experience but as obsolescence, weakness that had no place in her world of peak conditioning and aggressive youth. As his gnarled fingers worked to extract his wallet, his jacket sleeve rode up his forearm. The tattoo was immediately visible. The ink had faded from black to a hazy blue-gray, the lines blurred by 6 decades of sun and stretching skin. It showed an eagle, wings spread, talons clutching a bundle of arrows, a common enough patriotic symbol. Rostova's eyes swept over it dismissively. Just another piece of faded bravado from a bygone era. It meant nothing to her. She was focused on the ID, the tangible proof that would let her categorize this man and remove him from her world. But she'd made a critical error. She hadn't truly looked. Among the frozen recruits, one young man wasn't watching the confrontation. Private Miller, a bookish kid from Ohio who'd joined the Marines to prove something to himself, was staring at Randall's forearm with an expression of dawning horror. Miller was a history buff. He'd spent countless hours reading about military operations, particularly the classified one, and he'd seen that symbol before, not in official histories, but in the margins of obscure books, in grainy photographs on forgotten websites. Below the eagle, almost invisible in the faded ink and wrinkled skin, was a tiny detail, a skull superimposed over a 5-pointed star. Miller's heart hammered against his ribs. He knew what that meant. MACV-SOG, Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group. The most classified, most dangerous special operations unit of the Vietnam War. Men who'd operated behind enemy lines in Laos and Cambodia. Men whose existence was denied for decades. Ghosts. While Rostova, Gunn and Chavez focused their pressure on Randall, escalating their demands, Miller made his move. He let his rifle slip from his grasp, clattering onto the gravel. Clumsy. Miller. Sergeant Gunn bellowed. Strap came loose, Sergeant. Miller called back, his voice cracking. He knelt down, fumbling with the sling, making a show of fixing it. Then he backed away slowly, shuffled toward the barracks, and when he was out of sight, broke into a sprint. He had a phone call to make, one that would change everything. Private Miller's hands shook as he pulled out the contraband cell phone he kept hidden for emergencies. He ducked into a quiet corridor in the barracks and dialed with trembling fingers. The phone rang twice before a familiar gravelly voice answered. "John, what is it? You know you're not supposed to call during training." "Grandpa. I know. I'm sorry. But you have to listen." Miller's words tumbled out in a rush. He described everything. The old man, the drill instructors, the confrontation. "John, that's not a reason to risk." "No, Grandpa. It's the tattoo." Miller interrupted. "He has an eagle, but underneath there's a skull and a 5-pointed star." The silence on the other end stretched for 10 full seconds. When his grandfather spoke again, his voice had completely changed. The impatience was gone, replaced by deadly seriousness. "John," he said, his voice low and urgent, "describe the man to me." "Exactly." Miller described Randall. The faded blue eyes, the weathered face, the quiet dignity that hadn't broken even under Rostova's assault. "What's his name? Did you get his name?" I heard the sergeant call him Randall Morrison." A sharp intake of breath, then another long silence. "Son, listen to me, very carefully." His grandfather's voice was shaking now. "Do not let them move him. Do not let them take him anywhere. I don't care what you have to do. Create a distraction. Fake a medical emergency. Whatever it takes. Just keep him there." "Grandpa." "What?" "Help is on the way. I'm making a call." The line went dead. Private Miller stood alone in the empty corridor, the weight of something enormous pressing down on him. He didn't fully understand what he'd stumbled into, but he knew one thing. He'd just become a witness to something far bigger than a training ground dispute. He'd become a witness to a legend. Miles away, in a comfortable office at Marine Corps headquarters, retired Colonel John Miller Sr. was already dialing another number with fingers that hadn't trembled in combat, but were shaking now. The line connected. "Jack, it's me. I need you to listen very carefully." He relayed everything his grandson had told him. The description, the name, the tattoo. On the other end, Colonel Matthews, the current base commander of Parris Island, listened with growing disbelief. "Jack, the records say Morrison died in 9. Are you sure?" "The records were wrong," Miller Sr. said, his voice iron hard. "That's him. I'd stake my life on it." Colonel Matthews slammed down the phone and barked at his aide. "Get me Sergeant Major Morrison's service record. The classified file. Now." The aide scurried away, bewildered. Within minutes, a thin, dust-covered folder marked with the highest security classifications landed on the colonel's desk. Matthews opened it, and his breath caught in his throat. The black and white photo showed a young man with old eyes, and there, in stark official type, was the citation for the Medal of Honor. "My God," he whispered. Back on the training ground, Sergeant Rostova's patience had evaporated entirely. The old man had finally produced a wallet, but he was taking an eternity to extract his ID. His gnarled fingers moved with painstaking slowness that Rostova interpreted as calculated disrespect. The heat, the pressure, the old man's infuriating composure. It all pushed her past her breaking point. "That's it. I'm done playing games," she declared, her voice cold and final. "You are being detained for trespassing on a federal installation and impeding military training." She reached out and grabbed Randall Morrison's arm, her grip firm and unyielding. "You're coming with me. We'll sort this out at the station. And we'll get you a full medical and psychological evaluation, because clearly, "You're not all there." It was the ultimate She'd not only questioned his freedom, but his sanity. It was at that exact moment, as her fingers tightened on Randall's arm, that the sound began. Sirens. Faint at first, then rapidly growing louder. Every head turned. A convoy of 3 black command vehicles was racing toward them, lights flashing, kicking up a massive plume of dust. They didn't slow as they approached the training field. They drove directly onto the hallowed parade ground, a place usually reserved for marching and ceremony. They screeched to a halt, just yards from the confrontation, doors flying open before the vehicles had fully stopped. Colonel Matthews erupted from the lead vehicle, his face a mask of thunderous fury. The base sergeant major was right behind him, his presence alone enough to make most Marines tremble. They moved with speed and purpose that signaled a crisis of the highest order. The sight was overwhelming. The flashing lights, the slamming door, the 2 highest-ranking men on the base striding across the field with such urgency, brought dead silence to the entire area. Sergeant Rostova and her fellow drill instructors froze, mouths agape, struggling to process what was happening. Colonel Matthews and the sergeant major didn't even glance at Rostova. They walked past her as if she were invisible, their eyes fixed on one person, and one person only, the quiet old man on the bench. They stopped directly in front of Randall Morrison. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. Then in a single perfectly synchronized motion, the colonel and the sergeant major snapped to the sharpest, most profound salute of their career. It was a salute so crisp, so full of deep ingrained respect, that it seemed to vibrate with meaning everyone could feel even if they didn't understand it. The colonel cleared his throat, but didn't break his salute. "Sergeant Major Randall Morrison," he said, his voice ringing across the silent field, filled with emotion that was part awe and part profound apology. "It is an honor, sir." The recruits gasped. Sergeant Rostova's face went completely white, and Colonel Matthews began to tell them exactly who they were standing before. Colonel Matthews's voice carried across the training ground like a sacred recitation. "Sergeant Major Randall Morrison, enlisted United States Marine Corps, served with MACV-SOG, Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group." He paused, letting the weight of that name sink in. For those who don't know, MACV-SOG conducted the most dangerous missions of the Vietnam War. Cross-border operations into Laos and Cambodia, deep reconnaissance behind enemy lines, operations so classified they weren't acknowledged by the US government for over 20 years. The recruits leaned forward, hanging on every word. Rostova stood frozen, her hand still hovering where it had gripped Randall's arm moments before. On November 7, 1968, in the A Shau Valley, Matthews continued, his voice growing stronger. Sergeant Morrison's 12-man reconnaissance team was ambushed by an NVA force, estimated at over 200 soldiers. He looked at Randall, and there was genuine reverence in his eye. The initial contact killed or wounded half his team in the first 30 seconds. Their radio operator was dead. Their position was compromised. Standard protocol called for immediate extraction. The colonel's jaw tightened. Sergeant Morrison refused extraction. For 6 hours, 6 straight hours, he held that position alone, while his team was evacuated one by one, armed with an M14 rifle, a pistol, and whatever ammunition he could scavenge from the dead. He engaged an enemy force that outnumbered him more than 15 to 1. Private Miller was crying now, tears streaming down his face. He'd read about operations like this, but hearing it described while standing yards from the man who'd lived it was overwhelming. He was wounded 3 times during that engagement, Matthews said. Shrapnel from a grenade, a bullet through his left shoulder, another through his thigh. He kept fighting. He called in artillery strikes on his own position, danger close to keep the enemy from overrunning him. The colonel's voice cracked slightly. When the extraction helicopters finally came in, Sergeant Morrison was still standing, still firing. He'd run through over 800 rounds of ammunition. He'd held off an entire NVA battalion, and he'd saved every single member of his team who was still alive. He finally lowered his salute, his eyes never leaving Randall's face. For this action, Sergeant Major Morrison was awarded the Medal of Honor, but because of the classified nature of MACV-SOG operations, that award was never made public. It was presented in a closed ceremony attended by 7 people. The citation is still classified. The silence that followed was absolute. The official records, Matthews continued, his voice now cold as he turned to look at Rostova, list him as killed in action in 1998 during a classified operation. Those records were a cover. Sergeant Major Morrison retired quietly and requested complete anonymity. He wanted no recognition, no ceremonies, no attention. He looked back at Randall and his voice softened. He just wanted to live in peace, and we owed him that. The weight of those words hung in the humid air like a verdict. Colonel Matthews turned his full attention to Sergeant Rostova. His voice when he spoke was not loud, but it was colder and sharper than any bayonet. Sergeant, you stand on ground hallowed by the footsteps of men like this. Your job is to forge Marines, but you cannot forge them if you do not understand the metal they are made from. He took a step closer to her. You saw an old man and you showed contempt. You should have seen a Titan, and you should have shown him the respect he has earned 1,000 times over. Rostova stood rigid, her face pale, tears welling in her eyes. Her entire world view was crumbling. Sir, I had no idea, she stammered, her voice breaking. I didn't know. I couldn't have known. You're right, Matthews said, his tone not softening. You couldn't have known. But that's precisely the point. You didn't know, and yet you judged anyway. You saw his age and dismissed him. You saw his quiet dignity and interpreted it as weakness. Sergeants Gunn and Chavez had backed away, their faces ashen. They'd been complicit in the confrontation, and they knew it. Before the colonel could continue, Randall Morrison slowly rose to his feet. Every eye turned to him. He looked at the recruits, at the drill instructors, at the humbled Sergeant Rostova. When he spoke, his voice was calm and forgiving. The sergeant was doing her job, he said. Her job is to create disciplined Marines who are ready for anything. The world changes, the uniforms change, the weapons change, but the spirit inside the Marine does not. That is what matters. He looked directly at Rostova, and there was no anger in his pale blue eyes, only gentle wisdom. Discipline is vital, Sergeant, but compassion is what makes a leader. You can teach recruits to follow orders, but you can only inspire them to become Marines by understanding that every person, young or old, recruit or civilian, carries their own unseen battles. As he spoke, a memory bloomed in his mind, not of combat this time, but of brotherhood. He was 20 years old again, sitting in a makeshift tent deep in the Vietnamese jungle. The air was thick with canvas and sweat. A fellow Marine, his best friend Danny, was carefully inking the eagle onto his forearm with a homemade tattoo gun. They were all getting one, all 12 members of the team. It was a pact, a silent promise that they would never be forgotten, that what they were doing in that secret brutal war would mean something, even if no one else ever knew. The tattoo wasn't a symbol of war, it was a symbol of love for the men to their left and right. It was a mark of family, forged in the crucible of impossible choices. Randall blinked, and the memory faded. He was back on Parris Island, an old man surrounded by the young. Teach them well, Sergeant, he said to Rostov. They're counting on you. Sauce de dodos. The fallout was swift and decisive. Sergeant Eva Rostova was not discharged, a testament to Randall Morrison's plea for understanding. But she was immediately removed from her position as a drill instructor. Colonel Matthews, in a move that sent ripples throughout the training command, reassigned her to develop a new mandatory course for all instructors. The history of the Corps, with special emphasis on veteran recognition and oral histories. It was penance, but it was also an opportunity. A formal ceremony was held 1 week later. The entire base assembled to honor the quiet hero who had walked among them unnoticed. Randall Morrison, uncomfortable with the attention, agreed to attend only on the condition that it also honor all the men of MACV-SOG who had never come home. The ceremony was held at sunset. As Randall stood before thousands of Marines, young and old, he spoke only briefly. I didn't do anything special, he said, his voice barely carrying over the loudspeakers. I did what any Marine would do. I took care of my brother. That's the only job that matters. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. The real heroes are the ones who didn't make it home. Remember their names. Danny Vasquez, Mike Chen, Tom Rodriguez, Billy Washington, Kevin O'Brien, John Matthews, Henry Garcia. He recited all 6 names. His team members who had died in other operations, whose sacrifices had been buried in classified files for decades. Remember them, he said again, because they deserve more than silence. When the ceremony ended, Randall slipped away quietly, just as he'd arrived. He drove back to his modest home 3 hours away, parked his sedan in the driveway, and sat for a long time in the gathering darkness. The attention had been overwhelming, the recognition had been kind, but what he wanted most was what he'd always wanted: peace, the chance to remember his brothers without the weight of being called a hero. Heroes, he thought, were the ones who didn't come home. Survivors were just lucky. But even as he thought it, he knew his brothers would disagree. They'd tell him that surviving, that carrying their memory forward, that living a full life in their honor, that was the real mission. The one that lasted 50 years instead of 6 hours. He touched the faded tattoo on his forearm, feeling the raised scar tissue beneath the ink where shrapnel had torn through during that November night in The eagle, the arrows, the tiny skull and star that had started all of this. It was just a tattoo. But it was also a promise. A reminder, a connection to men who would be forever young while he grew old. "I'm still here, brothers," he whispered to the empty car. "Still carrying you forward." And in the silence that followed, he could almost hear Danny's voice. "That's all we ever asked, Randall. Just don't forget it." He never would. 3 weeks after the incident, Eva Rostova walked into a small coffee shop in the nearby town of Beaufort. She was dressed in civilian clothes, her hair down instead of pulled back in the severe bun required by her uniform. She saw Randall Morrison sitting at a small table by the window, sipping black coffee and reading a newspaper. Taking a deep breath, she walked over. He looked up, and a flicker of recognition crossed his face. For a moment she couldn't speak. Then the words, "Sir, I wanted to apologize in person. What I did, there's no excuse for it. I was wrong, and I am truly deeply sorry." Randall looked at her for a long moment, then gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit down, Sergeant," he said gently. He folded his newspaper and looked at her with those pale blue eyes that had seen so much. "You have learned," he said. "That is all that matters. Now tell me, how are the new recruits in Platoon 387 coming along?" It was an act of complete forgiveness, a simple, graceful gesture that closed the book on her shame and offered her a path forward. They sat there for an hour, a young Marine and an old one, talking not as antagonists but as members of the same enduring family. Rostova told him about her new assignment, about how she'd been researching MACV-SOG and other classified units, about how she was discovering stories that had never been told. "There are hundreds of them," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "Men who did impossible things and never received credit. How do you live with that? How do you carry it?" Randall was quiet for a moment, stirring his coffee. "You carry it the same way you carry anything heavy," he said finally. "One day at a time. And you remember that the recognition doesn't matter. The mission mattered. The men to your left and right mattered. Everything else is just noise." He looked at her directly. "But teaching the next generation, making sure they understand the history they're inheriting, that matters too. You're doing important work now, Sergeant. Don't waste it." Rostova nodded, feeling something loosen in her chest. She'd been carrying guilt like a stone for 3 weeks. His forgiveness didn't erase what she'd done, but it gave her permission to learn from it. As she stood to leave, Randall reached out and touched her arm gently. "One more thing," he said. "Don't just teach them about the heroes. Teach them about the mistakes too. Teach them about judgment and assumption. Teach them that the most important muscle a Marine has isn't in their body, it's between their ears." He smiled, a rare expression that softened his weathered face. "Teach them to think. That's how you honor the ones who came before." Rostova saluted, even though they were both in civilian clothes. Randall returned it with that same crisp precision, and she walked out of the coffee shop with a renewed sense of purpose. 6 months later, Private Miller stood at attention in front of his platoon. He'd been selected to give a presentation on military history as part of the new curriculum Sergeant Rostova had developed. His topic, MACV-SOG and the Hidden Heroes of Vietnam. On the screen behind him was a photograph he'd obtained through official channels, a grainy black and white image of 12 young Marines, all of them grinning at the camera despite the jungle fatigue evident in their face. Third from the left stood a 20-year-old Randall Morrison, his arm around Danny Vasquez. "These men," Miller began, his voice steady despite his nerves, "conducted 356 classified missions between 1967 and 1971. Of the 12 members of Recon Team Python, only 4 survived the war. Of those 4, only 1 is still alive today." He clicked to the next slide, a close-up of the tattoo, the eagle with its hidden skull and star. They marked themselves with this symbol because they knew their service would never be acknowledged. They knew their names would never appear in history books. But they wanted some way to recognize each other, to honor what they'd done together. He paused, looking out at the recruits who'd been present that day on the training ground. 6 months ago, I was standing right where you are. I saw an old man being treated with disrespect and I almost did nothing. I almost looked away." His voice grew stronger. "But I chose to look closer. I chose to see. And because I did, all of us got to meet a living legend. We got to hear his story. We got to learn that heroes don't always announce themselves." He clicked to the final slide, a quote he'd asked Randall's permission to use. "The real heroes are the ones who didn't come home. Remember their names. Sergeant Major Morrison taught us something that day." Miller concluded, "He taught us that rank and age don't determine worth, that quiet dignity can carry more weight than the loudest voice, and that every person we encounter might be carrying a story we can't imagine." He stood at attention. "That's a lesson I'll carry for the rest of my career. I hope you'll carry it too." The room erupted in applause, but Miller wasn't thinking about the recognition. He was thinking about a phone call he'd received the night before. Randall Morrison had called to thank him for his presentation. They'd talked for over an hour. At the end of the call, the old Marine had said something Miller would never forget. "You did good, son. You saw something that mattered, and you had the courage to act. That's what being a Marine really means. Not the shooting or the marching or the discipline. It's having the courage to do what's right even when it's hard." Miller had thanked him, his voice thick with emotion. "No, son," Randall had replied. "Thank you. You gave my brothers' voices back. You made sure they weren't forgotten." After he hung up, Miller had sat in silence for a long time, understanding finally what Randall had meant about carrying the weight. It was an honor, a burden, and a responsibility that would last a lifetime. 1 year after the incident at Parris Island, Randall Morrison sat in the audience at a graduation ceremony. Platoon 3087, the same recruits who'd witnessed his confrontation with Sergeant Rostova, were becoming Marines today. He hadn't planned to come, but Colonel Matthews had called personally, and Private Miller had sent a handwritten letter. They'd asked, and he'd found he couldn't refuse. Now, watching these young men and women march across the parade ground in their dress blues, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. They were so young, so eager, so unaware of what the world might ask of them, but they'd learned something important that day. A year ago, they'd learned to look deeper, to question assumptions, to understand that heroes came in unexpected forms. After the ceremony, Miller found him in the crowd. The young Marine, no longer a private but now a lance corporal, stood at attention and saluted. "Sir, thank you for coming." Randall returned the salute and then, breaking protocol, pulled the young man into a brief embrace. "You're going to be a hell of a Marine, John," he said quietly. "Your grandfather would be proud." Miller's eyes glistened. His grandfather, retired Colonel Miller, had passed away 2 months earlier. Randall had attended the funeral standing in the back, honoring a man who'd understood the weight of classified service. "He talked about you before he died," Miller said. "He said you were the bravest man he'd ever known. He said you taught him what it really meant to be a Marine." Randall shook his head. "Your grandfather was the brave one. He's the one who made the call that day." He recognized what others had missed. They stood together in comfortable silence. Two Marines separated by 6 decades but connected by something deeper than time. Sergeant Rostova approached, now wearing the insignia of a staff sergeant. Her new assignment had resulted in a promotion. Her curriculum had been adopted across all Marine training facilities. "Sir," she said, her voice respectful, "I wanted you to know your story, all the MACV-SOG stories. They're now part of required instruction. Every drill instructor in the Corps learns about the hidden heroes before they're allowed to train recruits." Randall nodded slowly. "That's good. That's right." She hesitated, then continued, "There's something else. We're naming the Platoon 3087 barracks after your team, Python Hall. So every recruit who trains there will see those names: Vasquez, Chen, Rodriguez, Washington, O'Brien, Matthews, Garcia. They'll know." For the first time in 50 years, Randall felt tears threaten. His brothers' names, spoken aloud, honored publicly. "Thank you," he managed. They'd be honored. As the sun set over Parris Island, casting long shadows across the parade ground, Randall Morrison touched the faded tattoo on his arm one more time. The eagle, the arrows, the hidden skull and star. It wasn't just a mark anymore. It was a bridge between past and present, between sacrifice and remembrance, between silence and story. His brothers were no longer forgotten, and that finally was enough.